Hello everyone. Today I will talk to Dr. Katherine Harvey, the author of Self-Fulfilling Prophecy, The Saudi Struggle for Iraq. A very interesting book. This book today will be our theme, and thank you very much, Katherine, that you being here. We are pleased that you accept our invitation. And so can you tell us, introduce yourself to your reader and your followers in Middle East and Iraq?
Absolutely. Dr. Rana, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm honored to be here. I'm so delighted that you liked the book and that you thought that it was worthwhile for me to speak to you about it today. And so I'm Dr. Katherine Harvey. I am American. I now live in Washington, D.C., where I teach at Georgetown University. This book was the product of many years and many years of research. It is the book version of my PhD thesis. I did my PhD here in London in Middle Eastern Studies at King's College London. And the book came out a few months ago, and I'm just so delighted that it's now available. And I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak to you about it today.
Thank you very much, Katherine. Now, Katherine, we would like to hear from you about your book. How would describe this book, and how you describe the concept of self-fulfilling prophecy?
And so I think that it's useful to explain how I came to this topic. And the topic is relations between Iraq and Saudi Arabia in the years after the 2003 invasion of Iraq. And when I started clearly I'm neither Saudi, or Iraqi. I'm American, I'm an outsider. This was a new topic for me. To be honest, when I began my research, I didn't really know that much about Iraq, so I had to learn a lot about Iraq. And at the beginning of my research, I was really interested in researching what was the response of Saudi Arabia and other Arab states, Sunni Arab states, primarily sort of the monarchies, but particularly Saudi Arabia. What was Saudi Arabia's response to Iran's rising influence in the region after 2003? And I was specifically interested in the period between 2003 until the Arab Spring. So from 2003 to 2010, that was the period that I was looking at. And I was, when I was beginning my research, and this is now a number of years ago, what I was doing at that time, I was going through a huge volume of news reporting from the Arab world from that period. So I was just going through literally thousands of articles that were all online, that were all kind of part of databases. I was each year going through news reporting. And I was looking at Iraq, what was going on in Iraq, and what was kind of the Saudi angle, what was the Iranian angle. And what I kept finding for 2003 to 2010, but particularly 2007, 2008, those years, what I kept finding was that, and it was a surprise to me, I found a range of Iraqi leaders from the Maliki government, Shia leaders, Sunni leaders, Kurdish leaders. They were making statements to the effect of, we want better relations with the Arab world. True. And we want better relations, particularly with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is our gateway back into the Arab world. And that was a surprise to me, because my assumption, and it was really just my assumption going into my research, because I didn't know that much about Iraq at this early stage. It was my assumption that after 2003, with the empowerment of the Iraqi Shia, and particularly with the Maliki government, that Iraq was sort of naturally in alignment with Iran. So it was a surprise to me that I found all of these leaders making statements saying, no, we want better relations with Saudi Arabia. And meanwhile, what was even more surprising to me was that the Saudis, as I was going through this news reporting, the Saudis had no response. There was no response that I could detect from news reporting. There was no statement, there was no indication that the Saudis were trying to reciprocate this outreach. And so that was very confusing, because I thought to myself, well, I know that Saudi Arabia by this point, 2007, 2008, was very concerned about Iranian influence in Iraq. Surely, if the Saudis, if there are these Iraqis reaching out, that would be a way for the Saudis to limit Iranian influence, to build a relationship with Iraq. But there was no response from the Saudis, and so that became sort of the puzzle that I sought to address in my research. Why was it that Saudi Arabia was not engaging with Iraq? And so my research question really became, why was Saudi Arabia not engaging with Iraq? And furthermore, what impact did that have on Iraq itself? And as I got further into my research, sort of the next thing I did was to do a whole bunch of interviews. And, I of course spoke to a lot of Iraqis and Saudis, but I also, being American, I also spoke to a number of Americans.
Yes, true.
And what I found out, Americans who, in this period, 2005, 6, 7, 8, had been sort of senior diplomats or senior officials who had dealt with the situation in Iraq.
They take part on the invasion?
Yeah, I spoke to people from really, I spoke to Paul Bremer, for instance, on the phone, through, Ryan Crocker, who was ambassador to, just a whole range of Americans, mostly sort of diplomats, but other government officials. And what I discovered was that, the Iraqis were reaching out to the Saudis. What I discovered also is that actually the Americans put enormous pressure on the Saudis to engage with Iraq, and the Saudis wouldn't do it. What I argue, and I recognize that this is sort of counterintuitive, much of the book draws on sort of a psychological framework, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is the self-fulfilling prophecy. And actually, it's probably useful to explain what exactly I mean by a self-fulfilling prophecy, because now it's a concept that's in the that everybody knows.
Yeah, we will talk about this, by the way, later on.
But actually, so a self-fulfilling prophecy is a concept that was originally formulated by an eminent 20th century American sociologist whose name was Robert Merton.
Yes.
And Robert Merton defined the concept as a false definition of the situation, evoking a new behavior which makes the originally false conception come true. In any case, my argument, and this is, I know, a bit counterintuitive, with regard to the Maliki government, and in particular with regard to Nouri al-Maliki himself, it is not my argument that Nouri al-Maliki was a good leader or that he was a paragon of virtue. But actually, what I found in my research, and he certainly had plenty of shortcomings. He was authoritarian, he could be highly sectarian. But what I found in my research was that actually when he became prime minister, and before, earlier in his career, he was not anti-Iran, but actually he was not pro-Iran. He was, the image of him is as an Iranian client, or even an Iranian puppet. And what I found in my research was that was incorrect. But what I argue is that the Saudis became convinced, even before Maliki became prime minister, the Saudis, and we'll talk about this, became convinced that Iraq was lost to Iran. And then when Maliki became prime minister, King Abdullah became convinced that Maliki was an Iranian puppet. And I argue that was incorrect. but I argue that Abdullah, in treating Maliki, in isolating Maliki, Abdullah ended up creating a self-fulfilling prophecy. Maliki did, and the Maliki government, particularly in his second government, of course, gravitated towards Iran, and Maliki became much closer to the Iranians. But what I argue is that that was not a result of some affinity that Maliki had for Iran. It's not because Maliki liked Iran, it was because he felt threatened by Saudi Arabia. And that was the self-fulfilling prophecy, that, you know, members of the Maliki government were reaching out to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia refused to engage. Members of the Maliki government, including Maliki himself, interpreted that Saudi decision as a Saudi intention, as a deep Saudi hostility to Iraq's new order, and even as a Saudi intention to reverse the new order. And over time, really by 2010 onwards, what that meant was that Maliki and others felt threatened enough that they gravitated closer and closer to Iran. And that's the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Perfect. Dr. Katherine, your book is talking about the three characters, let us say, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, as well US. So how you, and you know, in the human relationship is similar to the international relationship. Every part say I am right. So how you structure your book to give a chance to every character to explain itself, explain why it take this decision in that time and why it doesn't. Can you tell us?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, you know, I think of Saudi Arabia and Iraq as the protagonists, you know, the main characters, and Abdullah and Nouri al-Maliki as the main characters. But the secondary characters are absolutely Iran and the United States. And I think this might answer your question, or at least address your question. So in the book, I'm really looking at a foreign policy decision.
Okay.
You know, the Saudis' decision not to engage with Iraq. And decisions are made by human beings.
True.
You know, and the person, you know, I argue in the book, and I show in the book that this decision was really made by King Abdullah. You know, decisions are very personal, you know, and so at this level of foreign policy making, as you say, it's really very personalized, you know, kind of like the George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq. That decision was made by human beings, you know, and so in order to understand the decision,
Yes.
you have to understand, or what I had to do was sort of explore, you know, what did the world look like, or what did the situation look like to Abdullah and to the high level Saudis around him, and then what again, Nouri al-Maliki, who's, you know, on the cover of the book and is a main character, what did the situation look like to him? And then, of course, I did not speak to any Iranians in my research, but I spoke to a number of Americans. And so, you know, Americans who had lived through these events. And so I also found out what the situation looked like to them. But, you know, the first, but the first order of business was to understand, you know, what the situation looked like to King Abdullah. And to your point that human beings typically say, I'm right.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially the decision makers.
Yeah.
They're always true.
No, exactly. They wouldn't have gotten they wouldn't have gotten to the point where they are if they all have big egos.
That's true.
They all think that they're
Always
right.
There is excuses, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah. Maybe right, maybe wrong.
But
maybe right in the exactly time. Yeah, but maybe the outcomes become wrong.
Exactly. And so what I found was with, you know, the Saudi approach to Iraq in the very early years 2003, 2004. Most of the other Arab states were very concerned about the changes that were taking place in Iraq. And what was interesting was that, just as a point of comparison, the Jordanian King Abdullah and senior Jordanian officials were being very publicly vocal about their fears. But then the Jordanians very quickly sort of changed course. And so part of the book has this psychological framework. And I explore how, we human beings make decisions. We take decisions based on our beliefs. And our beliefs are subjective, just, because we're human beings. The way that we see the world is subjective. And so, we're not the prisoners of our beliefs. Our beliefs can change, but our beliefs are sort of naturally resistant to change. But they can change as new information becomes available. With other Arab leaders, the Jordanians, the Emiratis were also a very good example, that as more information became available from Iraq, they sort of incorporated this new information into their decision making, and they changed their policies. So instead of saying, I'm right, they said, oh, maybe things are different. And actually, there's a great quotation from Sheikh Abdullah, the foreign minister of the UAE, the Emirati foreign minister, who took a trip to Baghdad in 2008, and in Baghdad, he said publicly, he was at a press conference, and he said, it has taken us, Iraq's neighbors, it has taken us a long time to understand the new Iraq. Okay. Yeah, and that was, but he was like, but we're changing, we're learning, and so King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, however, I argue, he formed a perception of Iraq. And as new information became available, he really did not incorporate that new information into his decision-making calculus. He really stuck to an image of Iraq that wasn't correct. So to bring it back, I think, to what your question was, at this level, at the level that I'm looking at, these decisions are all made by human beings, and I very much explore the human element in this level of policymaking, and it's extremely personalized, and it's how did this person see the world, and was this person able to change and able to kind of change his view of the world. And I think with regard to King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, and it's not my purpose to be critical of King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. He did have many good qualities, but unfortunately with regard to Iraq, he had an image that was very rigid.
That's true.
Yeah, that was very rigid. And that's what led to the self-fulfilling prophecy. Yeah. That he had this image, this image that was very rigid, and it ended up creating the situation that he was hoping to avoid. And and of course this is not unique to King Abdullah. This happens in international relations, because again, at this level, foreign policy decisions are taken by human beings.
And Catherine, I think as researchers, we don't have the right to critique.
Yeah.
We just analyze the facts, the references, and the materials we have, and what we get, and we make sure that the science make the decision instead of us.
Right.
Who's right? Who's wrong? Who's the better?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, just to touch upon, a big debate in Washington right now with regard to the horrible conflict in Ukraine, there's a big debate in Washington as to whether Vladimir Putin is a rational actor or not.
Yeah.
I know. And I just want to say that if you take I know I'm getting ahead of myself. If you look at sort of the political psychology literature, political psychologists will say, well, nobody's a rational actor. We're human beings, so by definition, we are rational within our human constraints, within the constraints of our human perceptions, and so nobody's nearly as rational as they would like to think that they are.
That's true, absolutely. Dr. Katherine, I would like to quote from your book, exactly from page 83. You said, following the invasion, Saudi leaders frequently argued that the U.S., by virtue of the politics it was implementing in Iraq, had handed the country to Iran on a golden platter. What did you mean in this word? How can you explain this word, please?
And so this is, it's important to point out that this is what the Saudis were saying. This was the Saudis' conclusion. And you'll hear this frequently, even today, when I'm discussing Iraq with people, you'll hear people say, "Oh, the United States handed Iraq over to Iran on a platter, a valuable platter."
Yeah.
In English it's silver platter. In Arabic, I think it's golden platter. And where that so that phrase actually really originated with the Saudis, with the Saudi leadership, and really in my research, the senior level Saudis began to say that, and to tell the Americans that right after the invasion of Iraq, you've handed, by virtue of what you've done, you have handed Iraq to Iran
to be honest
on
with
a silver platter.
Why I concentrate on this, because now many of us
we see that no, exactly.
Yeah.
And so what I would say is that again, going back to the framework of this book, which really draws on political psychology. Political psychologists just in general tell us that uncertainty. We humans like to form conclusions. We like to form perceptions. We like to say, okay, this is what's going on. Okay. We don't like to keep an open mind, because quite frankly, uncertainty is uncomfortable.
Lack of dogmatism.
Yeah, no, exactly. Uncertainty is keeping an open mind is uncomfortable because we don't know exactly what's going on.
Exactly.
And so what I would say is that in 2003, in the summer of 2003, the Saudis began to say this: "You've handed Iraq to Iran on a silver platter or a golden platter." And what I point out in the book is that at that early stage, but political psychologists also say that we humans, we form conclusions long before there's enough information to support our conclusion. When the situation is still very gray, we see black and white, because that's more comfortable. Okay. And so what I try to point out on page 83 and in that section is that the Americans had made these major changes in Iraq, and the Saudis, and it was a highly ambiguous situation in Iraq at that time, and the Saudis formed a conclusion, and they really formed a conclusion that Iraq had been lost to Iran. Okay. Really before there was enough information to validate that conclusion. Okay. But again, going back to sort of the rigidity, that the Saudis' view was not very flexible. They formed that conclusion, and then they never deviated from it, And so because they interpreted all the information coming from Iraq through that lens, when they it colored their whole view of, they couldn't, it made sense to them that Maliki was an Iranian agent because of course Iran had taken over. So if Iran has taken over, then of course Maliki and everybody around him, they're just Iranian puppets. But so again, they had this definition of the situation that was just very rigid and didn't allow for new information to be incorporated into it. And that was, again, where the self-fulfilling prophecy comes in, that it was just so rigid. It was just so rigid.
Yeah, this is very good, because I think we don't want to judge instead of the readers.
Yes,
This book, after you finish it, anyone read it,
and
you will know exactly who's give the Iraq to in silver or
golden platter. And I should say that of course the changes that the Americans had made, because of course 2003 the Americans were in charge, of course empowered the Iraqi Shia community, which of course meant that Iraq was going to have a better relationship with Iran than under Saddam Hussein. There's no question that Iraq had a different that a Shia-led Iraq was going to have a different relationship with Iran. But my argument is that that Iran didn't just take over the country. That was too much. That was too much of a jumping to conclusions.
Dr. Katherine, and we are in IFBMC dealing with the growth and development in Iraq. Do you think that the regional relationship will affect the development and settlement on the country like Iraq? What is your opinion?
And I should say that development science is not my area of expertise, but I would say that what I've learned through my research, and again this is my perspective as an outsider to Iraq and to the region, that Iraq can only really be successful if it pursues a non-aligned foreign policy. And quite frankly, that's all of the recent governments have tried to do that. Is to try to say that yes, we're friends with both. We're friends with Saudi Arabia and we're friends with Iran.
I think the tool is wrong. They missed the tool, or
I'm sorry.
I think they missed the tool, or they missed the plan.
Yeah, but I think the problem is, in terms of the foreign policy alignment, is not so much Iraq, it's whether Iran and Saudi Arabia will allow Iraq to pursue a non-aligned foreign policy, to be friends with both. I know that Iraqis really see themselves as the victim of the Saudi-Iran rivalry, and I think that they're correct. They really have been the victim of the Saudi-Iran rivalry, so I hope for Iraq that the Saudis are of course now engaging, and I think that's very positive for Iraq. But I think that
the first decade is different.
Yeah, exactly. Really, since the death of Abdullah, the Saudis made a change, and it's really in the last year or two that the Saudis have begun to look at Iraq differently and saying, oh, maybe there's an opportunity for us there. But I think the jury is out. That's an American expression. I think that if Saudi Arabia wants to incorporate Iraq into an anti-Iran access, that's not going to be a good situation. That's not possible, I don't think. And similarly, if Iran wants Iraq in an anti-Arab axis, it's not possible. Iraq has to straddle both, has to be in both camps. And I will say that foreign policy aside, and this is not my area. This is not my focus or my area of expertise. This is more your area of expertise. The endemic corruption in Iraq is also a huge problem. That Iraq, of course, for development, it has to address its
definitely you agree
corruption.
That the settlement on region will reflect on settlement of every country on this region.
Absolutely.
Katherine, with the relevant brutal war going on the Ukraine, do you think that Putin's fears of a unified, stronger Europe is fast becoming self-fulfilling a prophecy? Or do you think opposite, which is mean that Europe and US have a fears from Putin's ambitions becoming self-fulfilling a prophecy? What is your opinion?
Yeah, so how does this framework relate to events today?
Yes.
And I think that it's, first off, important to distinguish that conflicts can break out, wars can break out, because there is in fact a true conflict of interest. So not all wars or conflicts are the result of self-fulfilling prophecies, but many are, in fact, because again, there's just a misperception that, oh yes, my adversary is doing X, Y, and Z, and therefore, but you can be wrong. Actually, one of the scholars I quote at the beginning of my book when I'm talking about the theoretical framework and political psychology, the scholar who's now deceased, his name was Ole Holsti, and it's always stuck in my head that he wrote, enemies who are defined as such often become. Let me actually, because it's right here. Because he didn't. It's essentially the self-fulfilling prophecy concept, or as Ole Holsti argues, quote, "Enemies are those who are defined as such, and if one acts upon that interpretation, it is more than likely that the original definition will be confirmed." Meaning that if you treat somebody like an enemy, more likely than not, they will become an enemy. And that's actually again, I recognize that Nouri al-Maliki had many shortcomings, and perhaps many in the audience don't like Maliki, or yourself included, but I argue that when he became prime minister, al-Maliki wasn't anti-Saudi. In fact, he wanted to develop a relationship with Saudi Arabia, and but the Saudis really treated him like an enemy. And today Maliki is, as you know, very vocally anti-Saudi. But I say that's, he was treated as an enemy and he became an enemy. Anyway, going to today with Ukraine and Putin. So, there are situations where there are legitimately conflicts of interest. For instance, World War II. Nazi Germany. Hitler did in fact want to take over all of Europe. But the situation is much more ambiguous with World War I. In World War I, everybody just assumed that everybody else and so nobody was expecting a big war. Everybody was expecting a little war, World War I, in a way, was a real self-fulfilling prophecy. With regard to Ukraine today and Russia, so I was saying that, is Putin a rational actor or not? And I would say that, again, nobody is nearly as rational as they like to think that they are. And I think Putin has very much created a self-fulfilling prophecy. He appears to have very deep grievances about Ukraine. He seems to think that Ukraine really is, historically, it was a part of Russia, that Ukraine really shouldn't exist. And so, I think he really did define the West as his enemy and NATO as his enemy. And obviously we were not close. We were not good friends. But this was not a war that the West or NATO was looking for or wanted. This was not a West that the United States wanted or that Ukraine wanted. I think that Putin really defined the situation as, the West is my enemy and Ukraine should be part of Ukraine should be part of Russia, and so he really provoked. Of course, initiated the invasion of Ukraine, and as a result, he's really turned all of NATO and the West against him. I mean, he has in fact provoked a real conflict. He defined the West as an enemy. And again, it's not like we were close friends. We were not. But he has, in fact, created a very real conflict as a result of his sort of, as a result of his actions, as a result of the invasion of Ukraine.
Actually, President Emmanuel Macron in 2021 warned that the European speech would make
fulfilling prophecy. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And actually, of course, I live in Washington D.C., so I'm sort of surrounded by the U.S. government. And of course, the U.S. and Russia are, we have been adversaries. We have defined Russia as an adversary. I think for a good reason, probably. But the situation was more complex for France and for Germany, particularly Germany. Germany was not anti-Russia.
That's true.
Yeah, up until now.
Until now, yeah.
And Putin, by taking this action, the invasion of Ukraine, has really turned Germany into an adversary. So yeah, exactly as you say, as President Emmanuel Macron said, he's created a self-fulfilling prophecy.
I think it's very dangerous
to
go far right to consider any country in the region enemy, or even dangerous if we go far left and considering real threatened in region, it's not enemy. So I think the decision makers should find a middle way.
Yeah.
It's not going extreme to make some elements in the region enemy, because this really creating self-fulfilling
prophecies
or enemies.
Yeah, and I will just say that with I've talked a lot about how we avoid self-fulfilling prophecies, or at least we're better positioned to avoid self-fulfilling prophecies when we are able to incorporate new information into our beliefs, and when we're able to not necessarily change our minds, but at least to adapt. And
exactly,
and what to adapt. And what really prevents or hinders adaptation is deep grievance. And I think that that's very true with Putin. I think Putin has a very deep grievance towards the West, towards the United States, clearly towards Ukraine. And I think that has really clouded his judgment and has led to the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Katherine, this book is very important to all specialized and scholars who are interested in studying foreign policy, regional relationship, especially between Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, as well US. But also this book is very important to all the scholars or specialists. They want to answer their question about the first decade after 2003 war in Iraq. Especially we are in Iraq, still we have a lot of blank answers about this period of time. Thank you very much. You accept our invitation. Thank you very much for your time, and we hope to see you soon. Katherine.
Dr. Rana, thank you so much for having me. I've truly been honored to be here. And again, I just want to say that, as an American who's written a book about your country and about your region, it really means so much to me that the book rings true to you, as a person from Iraq and a person from the region. And so I'm just very pleased that you speak so highly of it and that you think that it's helpful for your country.
Thank you very much, Katherine.
Thank you.